Welcome to podcast number 30 in my series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this podcast, we're going to talk about Queen Anne's War, which lasted from 1702 to 1713. In my last podcast, I talked about King William's War, which occurred during the 1690s between France and England for control of North America. That war had barely ended when Queen Anne's War began. In fact, Queen Anne's War is really a continuation of King William's War. In Europe, it was known as the War of the Spanish Succession. In New England, the patterns of fighting were exactly the same as in King William's War, but unlike King William's War, Queen Anne's War featured fighting in the South, in the Carolina backcountry, and in Florida. The war began in Europe because the King of France, Louis XIV, the Sun King, we talked about him in the last podcast, was attempting to get a relative enthroned on the Spanish throne in an effort to unite the Spanish and French empires into a mega empire. This prospect naturally terrified the rest of Europe. He also supported James II in his effort to regain the throne of England, which irritated the English who had kicked him out. Important constitutional, political, and economic events were happening at this time. The English colonies were just entering a new and more modern era. Some persons born during Queen Anne's War would live to see the American War of Independence, including Benjamin Franklin. On the screen right now is a map of what North America looked like in 1702. It hadn't really changed much since the beginning of King William's War a decade earlier. The green areas were controlled by Spain, the red areas were controlled by the English, and the blue areas were controlled by the French. Probably the most important and noticeable difference is that the French had begun pushing westward into the Great Lakes region. They actually founded a city, the city of Detroit, and then they began pushing south along the Mississippi River, founding a mission or two there, and then clear down south into what is today Louisiana, which is what the French named it, where they established some outposts on the Gulf of Mexico. On your screen now is another map of North America. It's identical to the one we were just looking at, but it shows the areas of fighting. Up in New England area, you'll notice that the fighting was almost identical to what went on with King William's War. The campaigning was almost the same. One of the major differences between King William's War and Queen Anne's War was that the Spanish had been allied with the English in King William's War, and now they were allied with the French. That kind of changed the pattern of fighting and explains why there was fighting between English Carolina and Spanish Florida. You'll notice on the map that Carolina had not yet been divided into North and South Carolina. It was still just one big colony. And the colony of Georgia hadn't been founded yet. It wouldn't be founded until the 1730s. On the screen now, you'll notice there's a map of the war in the South and the fighting that went on in the South. Numerically speaking, the Indians played a much bigger role in this fighting than they did up in New England. On the map, I've placed the names of the Indian tribes in italics, generally in the area that they were at when the war started. In the north, you have the Illinois, the Miami, and the Shawnee. And in the south, towards the Mississippi River, you have the Chickasaw, the Choctaw. In the central south, you have the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Appalachee. And then further east, you had the Catawba, Yamasee, and Tuscarora that were in or near Carolina. The European nations were attempting to form alliances with the Indians, not only because they wanted economic trading partners, but because they wanted the military advantages that came by having Indians as allies. And the Indians were doing exactly the same thing. They were trying to get the Europeans as trading partners and as military partners to use against their traditional enemies. If you were a European leader, you had to be careful how you chose sides because sometimes tribes didn't like each other, and if you tried to become allied with both, you might end up having to pick one over the other. On this map, you can see, for example, in Carolina, the Catawba tribe. It's hard to believe that the Iroquois Confederation, which was up in New York, would raid as far south as the Catawbas. Well, it was imperative that the English stay on good terms with the Catawba and the Iroquois, and so it was kind of hard for them to navigate between the two and pick a side if they had to. The French had the same problem with the Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians, which are near the Mississippi River on the left side of the map. They were bitter enemies, but the French wanted to have alliances and trading with both. The war in the South opened in 1702, the same year that the war actually started in Europe, when 500 Carolina militia and troops and 300 Allied Indians and 14 ships attacked St. Augustine in Florida. This force succeeded in destroying the town, but they couldn't capture the fort, and when a Spanish relieving force showed up, the English had to call off the attack, so that other than destroying the town, they didn't really accomplish much. In 1704, the Carolina government put together about 50 troops, Carolina troops, and about 1,000 allied English Indians, and they undertook a destructive campaign against the Appalachee Indians. If you look on the map, the Appalachee are down there in the panhandle of Florida. They were allies with the Spanish. For the English allied Indians, it was a campaign motivated in part by revenge. The Appalachee had raided some of these other Indians, and so these other Indians, now allied with the English, were interested in payback. The campaign was very destructive, and many of the Appalachee fled to the French for protection. Others were relocated that were captured by the English back in Carolina, and many fled deeper into Florida. The campaign was also very destructive to the Spanish because extending north and west from St. Augustine, there was a series of Spanish missions, much like they had along the California coast. On the map, you can see the four red explosions extending there near the Appalachee. This represents the destruction of the Spanish missions. About a dozen or so were destroyed by this combined English and Indian allied force, which greatly reduced Spanish prestige and influence in the area. It was probably the most destructive and successful campaign in the South, maybe in the whole war, and it greatly increased English prestige among many of the other Indian tribes in the region. In 1706, a combined Spanish and French force attacked Charlestown, which we call Charleston today, which was the capital of Carolina and really the only big town or city in the South. But the attack was a disaster, and the Spanish and French lost about 250 men and one ship, and the whole army, or what there was of it, degenerated into a plundering party that looted and stole slaves. If they had been better led and more determined, they probably could have sacked Charleston, which may have destroyed English influence in the South, though I don't know if the French or the Spanish were in a position to really hold on to it after that. I think the English would have taken it back. There were a few more attacks after that were done by the English and their Indian allies. They attacked the town of Pensacola in 1707, which is in the western part of the panhandle of Spanish Florida, and they also attacked the French town of Mobile in 1709. You'll notice on the map that I've shown the town of Biloxi as a blue empty box. That's because that was where the French first founded a town, and then they moved it further east, which I think annoyed the Spanish because they were kind of encroaching at that point on area that the Spanish had hoped to claim. The 1709 attack on Mobile pretty much ended the campaigns in the South. But even though fighting in the South had officially ended, the English themselves were quickly embroiled in wars with both the Yamasee and the Tuscarora Indians. In fact, the war with the Tuscarora began even before Queen Anne's War was over, and we'll have to talk about those in a separate podcast. All right, we now turn to the war in the North, in Canada and New England, and what was going on up there. On the map on the screen right now, you'll notice in the bottom left-hand corner, Fort Pontchartrain and the town of Detroit, which were built by a Frenchman named Antoine de la Motte Cadillac. And yeah, that word Cadillac is the exact same as our make of car, the Cadillac automobile, which is a little ironic since Detroit became Motor Town, the home of our auto manufacturing. Cadillac's a very interesting guy. I think he probably deserves his own podcast, but that would probably be beyond the scope of this series, so I'll leave that to someone else. In the North, the French were very smart. They didn't bother to attack New York because they didn't want to stir up the Iroquois. They focused on New England. They kind of decided to leave the Iroquois alone, and since New York was the English conduit to the Iroquois, they didn't want to bring them into the war or awake a sleeping grizzly bear, so to speak. This kind of annoyed the New England colonies, which felt that New York wasn't doing its part. And again, I think the Iroquois were one of the most underutilized resources the English could have had. For their part, the Iroquois were hoping to stay neutral. They didn't want to get involved in the war. In the previous war, King William's War, they had been attacked by the French and a lot of damage was done to them. They didn't want that to happen again. So they tried to stay as neutral as possible, and the French were happy to oblige them. The war in the North went very similar as to how it did in King William's War. The French and Indians launched raids against isolated towns whenever they could, spreading terror and damage, but not really doing much in terms of winning the war for them. In 1704, one of the most famous raids that happened was on Deerfield in Massachusetts. It was led by veteran Hertel, who was a French leader during the King William's War and was quite effective at leading French and Indian forces. This raid occurred in February, and the story is that the snowdrifts were high enough that they were up to the town walls, and so the French and Indians were able to simply climb over. Apparently there was no one on guard duty that night to notice what was happening. Deerfield had about 270 people, and the attack occurred in the early hours of the morning when it was bitterly cold. The town pastor, John Williams, described what happened. He wrote, "They came to my house, and by their violent endeavors to break open doors and windows with axes and hatchets, awakened me out of sleep. I called to awaken 2 soldiers in the chamber and returned to my bedside for my arms. The enemy immediately broke into the room. I judged the number to be about 20, with painted faces and hideous exclamations. Taking down my pistol, I cocked it and put it to the breast of the first Indian that came up, but my pistol misfired. I was seized by 3 Indians who disarmed me and bound me, leaving me standing only in my nightshirt for nearly an hour. Williams also witnessed the murder of 2 of his children and 1 of his black slaves by the Indians. By the time the raid was over, about half the houses in the town were destroyed, and about 110 people were carried off by the Indians, so almost half the town's population were either killed or carried off. After this raid, colonial officials decided it was time to go after some of the Indian allies of the French, particularly the Abenaki tribe. They're the tribe that's kind of north and just to the east of Boston there. So in May of 1704, commanded by Colonel Church, an expedition sent out from Boston. Colonel Church was a major in King William's War. He fought in that war too. He was about 65 years old at this time, and he was described as obese. He had with him about 550 volunteers. They were promised they would get to keep whatever loot they could carry, and they were also given a hefty bounty on scalps that they might bring back, and that was kind of an incentive to keep them. The campaign lasted for about 6 weeks. You'll notice on the map the red line running north of Boston. I've numbered it number 1. That represents Colonel Church's expedition. The solid red explosions represent the areas that he raided. He raided some of the Indian towns as well as some of the French settlements in what is today Nova Scotia. In 1707, there were 2 separate attempts to conquer Port Royale. It was known to be a place where French privateers could refit and find safety and then prey on British ships. Both attempts failed, and it led to a lot of disgust among the colonists, and they were particularly angry that they weren't getting much help from the mother country. In 1708, the raids by French and Indian war parties continued in Maine and even got as close to Boston as Haverhill. But in Haverhill, the French and Indian raiders met a stubborn resistance by colonists that stayed in their heavily fortified houses shooting out windows, and after several hours of firing, the raiders finally left because they couldn't really do much. Also in 1708, the French were able to sack St. John's. On the map, it would be just a little off the right edge of the map up there in Newfoundland. It didn't amount to too much, and the English eventually retook it. On the screen now is a map depicting the last few campaigns of the war, all of them conducted by the English. They would be the largest campaigns of the war. In 1709, English authorities, after much lobbying from colonial officials, decided to take the war more seriously. They decided on a full-scale invasion of Canada, which would include 4,000 regular English troops aboard a powerful fleet of warships that would sail out of Boston and down the St. Lawrence River to attack Quebec. And then coming up through Lake Champlain, another force of 2,700 militia and Indians would attack Montreal and envelop Canada. But after all this work, English officials in London thought that a peace treaty might be near, and so they canceled the project, which utterly frustrated the colonists, who were hoping to once and for all rid their backcountry of the French, who kept stirring up the Indians and doing these devastating raids. In 1710, Connecticut and Massachusetts decided it was time to attack and permanently take over the French fortress of Port Royale in what is today Nova Scotia. Back then, the French called it Acadia. England contributed 6 warships to the effort, and they were successful in capturing Port Royale, which they renamed Annapolis Royale in honor of Queen Anne. This was probably one of the most successful campaigns of the war, and it also rid the New England coastline of all the French privateers that were stalking English and colonial ships. In 1711, a second attempt was tried to invade Canada. This time the English did contribute plenty of resources, and it probably could have succeeded. The plan again called for one invasion force of almost 7,500 total men and 60 warships to leave Boston, sail out into the St. Lawrence River, and attack Quebec. A second prong would go up from Lake Champlain to attack Montreal of about 2,300 militia and Indians. This was an enormous invasion force. Nothing in the colonies had been seen like this before. As the main force left Boston on July 30th and began its sail up into the St. Lawrence River, they found that the St. Lawrence River, when they got there, was fog-bound, and several of the ships in the fleet ran aground, and about 900 men were lost in the wreckage. This was about 160 miles from Quebec, and the commanders of this English force were kind of timid. They decided to turn back and abandon the attempt. Colonel Francis Nicholson, who was commanding the force that was coming up through the Lake Champlain way to attack Montreal, when he got word that the whole thing had been abandoned, was apparently so angry that he threw his wig on the ground and began stomping it in frustration. I wish I had a video clip of that. He wasn't the only one that was frustrated. Colonial officials and the colonists themselves were utterly disgusted and frustrated with this timid approach. There were a lot of resources used here, and they could have probably easily overwhelmed Canada if their commanders had been better. It was the typical problem the English had. They had the resources, did not have the leadership. The French Canadians kind of had the opposite problem. The way in which the French Canadians and the English Puritans reacted to this whole thing is kind of interesting. The Catholic French held masses of thanksgiving that they were spared this invasion, while the English Puritans in New England started repenting over the calamity and seeing it as evidence of God's wrath for their wickedness. Queen Anne's War ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. The war did much to discredit the mother country among the English colonists in North America, and probably sowed the early seeds of independence and discontent. In fact, one French writer predicted that if Canada had been conquered, the Americans will, quote, then unite, shake off the yoke of the English monarchy, and erect themselves into a democracy. So I think that other people were noticing the attitudes of the colonists about the English. We've talked about that before in my podcast on some of the New England colonies, how independent they were and how much they rebelled or often chafed at any regulation coming out of London. The war left New England financially exhausted. French privateering had taken a toll on the New England economy, and there were shortages of food, and taxes went up by about 40%. You've probably noticed from these podcasts what an important role the Indians played militarily. They certainly had a vested interest in what was happening, and one colonial leader made this comment. He said, "We have found none like Indians to hunt down Indians," so they knew they would need Indians out in this wilderness to help them in their fighting. One of the important political and constitutional events that happened during the war was the Act of Union of 1707. This combined England and Scotland into one united country that was now known as Great Britain. The next major war between France and England would be decades away, but the North American backcountry would continue to simmer with conflict and wars. In addition to the books and articles I recommended in my previous podcast, I also recommend the following: The Indian Slave Trade, The Rise of the English Empire in the American South, 1670 to 1717, by Alan Gallay. The Struggle for a Continent, The Wars of Early America, by John Ferling. Atlas of the North American Indian, by Carl Waldman. And Defying Indian Slavery, Appalachian Voices and Spanish Sources in the 18th Century Southeast, by Alejandra Dubkovsky, published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 75, Number 2, April 2018.